My name is Samuel Turner, a 39-year-old park ranger, and my life took an irreversible turn the summer my cousin Alice went missing. It's a story I've spent years trying to forget, but memories don't fade as easily as you'd hope, especially when they're painted in shades of blood and shadow. Shadow Ridge National Park had always been a sanctuary for me, a place where I could escape the clamor of the world. But that summer it became something else entirely. It began on a Sunday evening with a frantic call from Alice's younger brother, Nick. Alice hadn't returned from her hike. She was a seasoned hiker, but Shadow Ridge was vast and unforgiving. The thought of her loss somewhere out there was unbearable. Nick insisted on joining the search. I was hesitant at first. After all, this was my job, my domain. But he was my brother, and Alice was our cousin. This was family business, not just ranger duty. The authorities were already alerted, but Nick and I couldn't just sit and wait. We set out at dawn, the forest wrapped in a thick mist that seemed almost alive. The first day of searching yielded nothing but aching legs and a growing sense of dread. Nick was quiet as we walked, his jaw clenched and his eyes scanning every shadow. We combed through Alice's usual routes, calling her name until our voices cracked. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we returned to the ranger station with nothing but the weight of unanswered questions. That night, I found myself staring at the map of the forest, my hands trembling. Nick sat across from me, his face pale. "What if something got her?" he whispered, as if speaking the thought aloud would summon it. "Don't start with that." I snapped, harsher than I intended. I took a deep breath and softened my tone. "We'll find her. We have to." But I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. Shadow Ridge had its fair share of ghost stories. Campfire tales about strange figures and whispers that seemed to follow you in the dark. I'd always chalked them up to overactive imaginations. Until now. The next morning, the search expanded. Volunteers from the nearby town joined us, their faces grim but determined. We divided into teams and combed through the less traveled areas of the forest. By midday, I received a call over the radio that made my blood run cold. "Samuel," came the shaky voice of one of the volunteers. "We found something. You need to see this." The coordinates led us to a clearing deep in the woods. It was a place I didn't recognize, and I knew these trails like the back of my hand. The air felt heavy as Nick and I approached. In the center of the clearing lay Alice's backpack. It was torn, the fabric shredded as if by massive claws. A trail of blood led away from it, disappearing into the trees. Nick froze, his face going white. I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said, but he was already running, following the trail. "Nick, wait," I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the forest. I ran after him, my heart pounding. The trail led us deeper and deeper into the woods, to a place I'd never seen before. Then we found the cabin. It was ancient, its wood warped and blackened with age. The windows were shattered, and the door hung askew. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet stench that turned my stomach. Nick hesitated, and for a moment I thought he might turn back. But then we heard it, a low, guttural growl from inside the cabin. Nick looked at me, his eyes wide with terror. "We have to see," he whispered. I nodded, my hand tightening around the flashlight. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. Blood stained the floor, streaked in patterns that made no sense. In the center of the room lay Alice, or what was left of her. She was torn apart, her body mangled beyond recognition. Nick fell to his knees, a guttural sob escaping his throat. That's when we heard it, a scraping sound like nails on wood. I turned the flashlight toward the noise, and there it was. The creature. It stood hunched, its pale skin stretched tight over elongated limbs. Its eyes were black voids, reflecting nothing. For a moment, it just stared at us, as if assessing whether we were worth the effort. "Run," I hissed, grabbing Nick's arm. But he was frozen, his eyes locked on the thing. The creature moved fast, faster than anything that size should. I shoved Nick toward the door, and we ran. Behind us, the cabin erupted in a cacophony of crashing wood and guttural roars. The forest seemed to close in around us as we ran, the trees a blur in the dim light. I didn't dare look back, the sound of the creature's pursuit pushing me forward. Somehow, we made it to the ranger station. We slammed the door shut and bolted it, collapsing against the walls as we tried to catch our breath. The creature didn't follow. For now, when the authorities arrived, they found the cabin empty. No creature, no Alice, just the blood-streaked floor and the shredded remains of her backpack. The official report blamed a bear. I didn't argue. Neither did Nick. He couldn't. By the time the investigation wrapped, he was already in a psychiatric hospital, his mind fractured by what he'd seen. As for me, I stayed. I nodded along when the authorities dismissed the incident, but I knew the truth. Something unnatural had taken Alice, and it was still out there, waiting. Every night, as I sit in the ranger station, I hear the whispers in the trees. They sound like Alice calling for help, but I know better. I know it's really out there. The weeks after Alice's death crawled by in a haze. My brother, Nick, was still in the psychiatric hospital, and the ranger station felt colder than ever. I spent my shifts patrolling the forest, but my mind was never far from the cabin and the creature that had shattered our lives. Shadow Ridge's towering pines now seemed like sentinels to some unseen malevolence. One late evening, the whispers started again. It was faint at first, a soft, melodic hum that seemed to drift on the wind. I was walking the perimeter of the southern trails when I heard it, the sound cutting through the quiet like a razor. My breath hitched. I froze, turning my flashlight toward the source. The trees swayed gently, but the air was still. "Samuel," the voice called soft and sweet. It was Alice. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My mind raced, logic fighting with instinct. "You know it's not her," I whispered to myself, gripping the flashlight tighter. But my feet had already begun to move. The voice led me off the trail, deeper into the underbrush. My boots crushed dried leaves as the sound grew louder, guiding me further into the unknown. I knew I was making a mistake, but I couldn't stop. The voice was so convincing, so achingly familiar. The whispering led me to the old cabin again. It loomed in the darkness, more decrepit than before. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the dim interior. My heart pounded in my chest, my every instinct screaming to turn back. "Samuel," the voice said again, softer now. It came from inside. I stepped into the cabin, the flashlight beam illuminating the blood-stained floor. The room felt different this time, colder and more oppressive. The smell of rot and mildew was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were decaying. My hand hovered near my radio, but something told me that no amount of backup could help me now. I scanned the room, the beam catching every grotesque detail. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the walls were etched with unfamiliar symbols. They glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the sound of my racing heart. A sense of wrongness permeated the air, heavy and choking. Then, from the far corner of the room, I saw it again. The creature. It emerged slowly, its pale skin gleaming in the weak light. Those black, soulless eyes locked onto mine, and a guttural growl rumbled from its chest. But this time there was something different about it. It held something in its elongated hand, a scrap of fabric. Alice's jacket. My stomach turned. The creature tilted its head, as if mocking me. It took a step closer, its claws tapping against the wooden floor. The sound was deliberate, calculated, like it wanted me to know it could reach me anytime it chose. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The creature didn't answer, but its growl grew louder, the sound reverberating through my chest. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, casting a sickly green glow over the room. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath visible in the flashlight's beam. Frost crept across the floorboards, cracking and splintering the wood beneath my feet. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted in place. Then the creature lunged. It moved with an unnatural speed, crossing the room in a blur. I threw myself to the side, barely avoiding its grasp. The flashlight flew from my hand, its beam spinning wildly across the room. In the chaos, I caught glimpses of the creature, its jaws snapping, its claws raking the air where I had been moments before. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the door. The creature paused, its head cocking to one side as if puzzled by my desperation. That's when I noticed something else. The symbols on the walls were fading, their glow dimming with each second. Taking the chance, I bolted for the door. The creature roared behind me, a sound that shook the very foundations of the cabin. As I crossed the threshold, the air felt lighter, as if I'd broken through some invisible barrier. I didn't stop running until I was back on the trail, the cabin disappearing into the shadows behind me. The next day, I received an unexpected call from Nick's doctor. Nick was stable, but insistent on speaking to me. "He's been asking about Shadow Ridge," the doctor said, her voice hesitant. "I don't know if this will help or hurt him, but he's adamant." I didn't hesitate. Nick might have been broken, but he was still my brother, and I owed him more than I'd been able to give. By evening, I was sitting across from him in a sterile, dimly lit room. His face was gaunt, but his eyes held a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "You went back," he said without preamble. It wasn't a question. I had to. I replied. "It's still out there, Nick. It's not over." His hands tightened into fists. "We have to end it together. Alice deserves that." I started to protest, but his expression stopped me. There was a fire in his eyes I hadn't seen since before the cabin. Against my better judgment, I nodded. The forest was darker that night than I'd ever seen it. Clouds obscured the moon, and the air carried a suffocating weight. Nick walked beside me, clutching a rifle he hadn't held in years. We spoke little, the silence between us filled with unspoken fears. As we approached the cabin, the whispers returned, faint and taunting. Nick flinched, but his grip on the rifle didn't waver. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my pulse hammering. The whispers grew louder, circling us like a predator playing with its prey. When the cabin came into view, it was worse than before. The walls seemed to breathe, and the symbols glowed with a feverish intensity. The door creaked open on its own, inviting us in. "You don't have to do this," I said, placing a hand on Nick's shoulder. He shook his head. "Alice needs us." We stepped inside together. The air was frigid, each breath forming a cloud of mist. The creature was waiting, its massive frame hunched in the corner. It rose as we entered, its black eyes locking onto us. In its clawed hand was something new, a locket. Alice's locket. Nick let out a choked cry. "You bastard," he roared, raising the rifle. The creature growled, the sound shaking the walls. Before Nick could fire, it lunged. I tackled Nick to the floor as the creature's claws raked the air above us. "Move!" I shouted, dragging him toward the symbols on the walls. "They're its weakness." Nick scrambled to his feet, his rifle clattering to the floor. The creature turned its attention to me, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I raised my flashlight, the beam catching its soulless eyes. It recoiled, giving us a moment to regroup. "The symbols," I repeated, Nick grabbed a knife from his belt and slashed at the glowing markings. The creature screamed, its body convulsing. Black smoke poured from its wounds, filling the cabin with the stench of decay. "It's working," Nick shouted. He moved to the next symbol, carving it out of the wall. Each strike sent the creature into a frenzy, its body writhing as the symbols faded. But it wasn't enough. The creature surged forward, knocking me into a corner. My head hit the wall, and the world spun. Through the haze, I saw Nick standing his ground, his knife glinting in the dim light. "You want me?" he shouted. "Come and get me." The creature roared and lunged. Nick dodged at the last second, driving the knife into its side. Black ichor sprayed across the room as the creature let out a deafening scream. It collapsed, its body dissolving into a pool of darkness that seeped into the floor. The cabin shuddered, the walls groaning as if the entire structure was alive. I pulled myself to my feet and grabbed Nick. "We need to go. Now!" We stumbled out into the night as the cabin collapsed behind us, swallowed by the forest. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. Nick sank to his knees, clutching the locket. Tears streamed down his face, and I knelt beside him. "She's gone," he whispered, "but we stopped it. For her." I placed a hand on his shoulder, my own tears falling. "For Alice." As we made our way back to the ranger station, the forest felt different. Lighter, as if a shadow had been lifted. But deep down, I knew the truth. Shadow Ridge still held its secrets, and some things were never meant to be understood. My name is Dale Trenton, and for 35 years, I was a ranger in the shadowy wilderness of Blackstone National Park. The years I spent in those woods gifted me countless memories, many of them peaceful, some profound. But one night in 1992 left a scar on my soul that never healed. It's the story I kept buried until now, shared only with my grandson, Liam, a journalist probing into the old, forgotten corners of my life. It was early autumn, the air cool and sharp with the promise of winter. A scattering of gold and crimson leaves dotted the forest floor. The sky overhead thick with clouds that muted the moon's light. I was at the ranger station, finishing up routine logs, when the radio came alive with static, followed by a panicked voice. "This is Officer Caro at Checkpoint 4, the voice stammered. "We got a 10 to 57. A couple parked off Fire Trail 7. Woman's on the radio. Says her boyfriend got out after hearing a noise and he's gone. She locked herself in the car and is screaming for help." Then the connection cut off. I froze, my hand hovering over the logbook. "Cut off," I repeated, grabbing the receiver. Yeah, 1 second she was there, next nothing, not even static. Caro's voice was shaky, uncharacteristically nervous for a man who'd spent years stationed out here. "Trenton, you're closest. Can you check it out? Backup's at least 30 minutes out." It wasn't unusual for me to handle emergencies solo. Rangers were used to being alone in the wild. But there was something in Caro's tone, an edge I didn't like. Still, I swallowed the knot in my throat and responded, "On my way." The engine of my old Jeep roared to life as I sped along the gravel road. Fire Trail 7 was one of the more secluded routes in Blackstone, a narrow, twisting path that wound through dense thickets of pine and oak. It was a favorite for campers and stargazers, but it wasn't a place you'd want to be caught alone after dark. The forest out there felt heavier, more alive, as if the trees themselves leaned in to watch your every move. I reached the turnoff after 20 minutes and found the faint glow of tire tracks in the dirt, leading into a clearing just out of sight. My stomach tightened as I followed them. When the Jeep's headlights cut into the small grove, I stopped cold. There was no car. I stepped out, shining my flashlight over the area. The tire tracks ended abruptly, and scattered across the dirt were what looked like blood spatters, stark against the pale earth. My pulse quickened as I crouched down to examine them, still fresh. And just beyond the tracks, I noticed something else. Drag marks leading into the black maw of the forest. I reached for my radio, my hand shaking. "Caro, I've got blood and tracks leading into the woods. The vehicle's missing. Request backup now." The drag marks led into the forest like a whispered dare. My flashlight's beam wavered as I stepped off the trail, swallowed by the thick underbrush. The trees seemed to close ranks behind me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every step sent a dull thud through the earth, and each sound seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Caro," I said into my radio, trying to keep my voice steady, "I'm following a blood trail about 100 yards south of Fire Trail 7. No sign of the vehicle or anyone yet. ETA on backup." Static hissed back at me, then silence. "Damn it," I muttered, tucking the radio into my vest. The blood trail was faint at first, scattered drops on leaves and roots. But it grew thicker the further I went, staining the ground in streaks as though something, or someone, had been dragged through the underbrush. I kept my hand close to my holster, the comforting weight of my revolver doing little to quell the unease tightening in my chest. I paused for a moment, crouching to examine the tracks again. They didn't make sense. The drag marks were wide, heavy, more than a single person's weight could account for. And there were smudges in the dirt beside them, as if something with claws had been pacing alongside the trail. I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a shadow, quick and low, darting between the trees. My heart jolted, and I swung the flashlight in its direction. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the impenetrable tangle of branches and shadows that seemed to mock me. "Hello?" I called, my voice swallowed by the forest. Nothing answered, not even an echo, not even the usual chorus of insects or the rustle of nocturnal animals. I was beginning to feel the wrongness of this place settling into my bones. I didn't have long to dwell on it. A sound pierced the silence, a soft, shuddering sob. I froze. "Who's there?" I called, straining to pinpoint the direction. The sobs continued, faint and fragile, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The beam of my flashlight swept over mossy ground and ancient roots, the crying growing louder with each step. But something about it wasn't right. It was too rhythmic, too perfect, like it was being played back on a loop. And then it stopped. I halted in my tracks, my breath catching. For a moment, all I heard was the pounding of my own heart. The air felt colder now, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. Ahead, in the gloom, I spotted a clearing. My flashlight flickered, and I gave it a frustrated shake as I stepped into the open space. What I saw next stopped me dead. There was the missing car, or what was left of it. The vehicle sat at an odd angle, its front end buried into the dirt, as though it had been tossed there by some unseen force. The windshield was shattered, jagged shards of glass glittering like frost in the flashlight's glow. One of the doors hung open, its metal frame bent and clawed as though something had torn it apart. And inside, the driver's seat was smeared with blood. I forced myself to move closer, stepping cautiously toward the wreck. My foot nudged something soft, and I looked down to see a torn scrap of fabric, red and white gingham, like the kind you'd see on a picnic blanket. It was soaked through with blood. My stomach turned, but I kept going. The passenger door was locked, but the driver's side, that's where I saw it. A trail of bloody handprints streaked along the outside, leading away from the car and back into the woods. Whoever had been in there was alive, at least for a time. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my back, and when I turned, I saw nothing. Just trees, endless and suffocating. Grabbing the radio again, I whispered, "Caro, the car's here. Total wreck. Blood everywhere. No sign of the couple. Where the hell is backup?" The static replied, rising in volume, before fading into a burst of unnatural clicks and pops. A voice broke through then, distorted and faint. "Get out!" I stared at the receiver in disbelief. "Caro, is that you?" More static, and then silence. A branch snapped behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight darting through the darkness. The beam landed on a trail of blood leading further into the forest, where the trees seemed impossibly dense. That was when I heard something else, a low rumble, deep and guttural like the growl of a bear, but wrong. It came from the path ahead. I stepped back toward the car, my hand gripping my revolver tightly. I had no idea what I was walking into, but the forest felt alive now, closing in around me with every second. And I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't waste any time. My hand stayed on the revolver as I backed away from the car. My flashlight trained on the blood trail that disappeared into the blackness ahead. The growl rumbled again, closer this time. Whatever was out there wasn't making any effort to stay hidden. The static hissed on my radio, startling me. This time it was followed by a familiar voice. "Dale, it's Martin. I'm 10 minutes out. What's your location?" Relief flooded through me. "Martin," I said, my voice trembling. "Get here fast. The car's wrecked, and there's blood everywhere. Something's out here with me." A pause. Then Martin's voice came back, steady but urgent. "Stay put, Dale. Don't go any further. I'm almost there." Stay put? Every instinct in me screamed to retreat, to let the backup arrive before doing anything reckless. But the trail of blood leading into the trees, the lingering sense of someone or something watching, I couldn't stand there waiting, not knowing. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. The air grew colder as I pressed forward, my breath coming out in shallow clouds. The forest seemed darker now. The trees gnarled and twisted like frozen sentinels. The blood trail snaked through the underbrush, smearing across roots and rocks, growing fainter the further I went. "Dale!" a voice shouted behind me. I turned to see Martin jogging toward me, his rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was pale under the beam of his flashlight. Martin was one of the oldest rangers on the force, a man who had faced mountain lions, raging rivers, and everything else nature could throw at him without flinching. But tonight, his hands shook as he gripped his gear. "You weren't supposed to follow it alone," he scolded, stopping to catch his breath. I gestured toward the trail ahead. "The blood doesn't lie, Martin. Whoever was in that car, if they're still alive, they're out here." Martin glanced around, uneasy. "This place doesn't feel right. It hasn't since I got here." He lifted his rifle, scanning the surrounding trees. "If we go any further, we stick together. You see or hear anything, you let me know." We moved cautiously, stepping around tangled roots and low-hanging branches. The blood was harder to follow now, scattered in smaller droplets. But the tracks, those clawed, unnatural impressions in the dirt, were clearer. Whatever made them was heavy, and it wasn't human. "You seen tracks like these before?" I asked quietly. Martin shook his head. "Nothing like this, and I don't want to find what made them." The growl returned, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to ripple through the earth itself. We froze, flashlights sweeping across the trees, but the source of the sound stayed hidden. "Over there," Martin whispered, pointing with his rifle. I followed his gaze to a shadow deeper in the woods. It wasn't moving, but it was too large, too unnatural to be a tree. We edged closer, our lights trembling as they reached the edge of a smaller clearing. And then we saw them, Two bodies, twisted and broken, lay in the middle of the clearing. It was the couple. The man sprawled on his back, his face frozen in a mask of terror. The woman's body was crumpled a few feet away, her arm outstretched as though she had tried to crawl. Blood soaked the ground beneath them, pooling around their lifeless forms. "God," Martin muttered, his voice barely audible. What could have done this? I crouched down, examining the scene through a growing haze of dread. Their injuries weren't clean. These weren't wounds inflicted by an animal. The deep gashes and punctures looked deliberate, like something had taken its time. The growl came again, louder, almost a snarl now. This time it came from directly behind us. Martin swung his rifle around, his finger already on the trigger. "Dale, get behind me!" I stood and turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the darkness. And then it stepped into the beam. I don't know how to describe it. Not fully. It was massive, its shape distorted by the shadows, but its eyes burned like embers in the gloom. Its body was lean but powerful, covered in mottled fur that seemed to shimmer like smoke. And its face, the jaws were too long, filled with jagged teeth that gleamed wetly in the light. It let out a sound, half growl, half chuckle, that sent a jolt of primal terror straight to my core. Martin fired. The rifle's deafening crack echoed through the trees, and the creature flinched. Blood, thick and black, splattered onto the ground. But it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged. I barely had time to react before it was on Martin. He screamed as the creature's claws raked across his chest, throwing him to the ground like a rag doll. My revolver was in my hand before I even realized it, and I fired twice, the shots landing square in the creature's side. It snarled, spinning toward me now, its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then it leapt into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I stumbled to Martin, kneeling beside him as he clutched his chest. Blood soaked his uniform, pooling beneath him as his breathing grew ragged. "Stay with me, Martin," I pleaded, my voice cracking. He looked at me, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You have to leave," he whispered. "Get out of here. That thing, it's still watching us." I sat there with Martin, pressing my jacket against his chest in a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. His breath rattled, shallow and uneven, and his eyes flickered with a growing vacancy. The forest felt alive around us, but not with life. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something else to happen. "You're not dying here," I said, though my voice shook as much as my hands. "Help's coming. You hear me? Stay with me, Martin." But deep down, I knew no one was coming fast enough. Martin's hand gripped my arm, weak but insistent. "Don't waste time on me," he rasped. His face twisted with pain, but his eyes burned with a desperate urgency. "That thing, it's still out there." His words hung in the air as a heavy snap of branches echoed through the trees. I turned, my flashlight jerking toward the sound. For a moment, all I saw were shifting shadows, the skeletal outlines of trees twisted and gnarled. But I felt it, something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. Watching. "Stay here," I whispered to Martin, as if he had the strength to go anywhere. I rose to my feet, revolver trembling in my hand as I took a step toward the tree line. The blood trail from the creature's wound gleamed faintly in the flashlight's beam. A viscous black streak smeared across the ground. It led deeper into the woods, into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the light entirely. "You're not thinking about following that thing, are you?" Martin croaked behind me, coughing up blood. I hesitated, looking back at him. His pale face was slick with sweat, and his grip on consciousness was tenuous at best. I couldn't leave him, but I couldn't stay either. If I stayed, the thing would come back. And this time, neither of us would survive. I'll come back for you, I promised. Stay awake. Stay alive. Martin tried to argue, but his voice failed him. I turned away, swallowing the lump in my throat, and followed the blood trail into the woods. The forest closed in around me, the trees growing impossibly dense. My flashlight barely seemed to penetrate the suffocating darkness, and every snap of a twig or crunch of leaves made my heart lurch. The air was colder here, so cold I could see my breath clouding in front of me. My footsteps sounded too loud, too exposed, as if I were intruding on a place I wasn't meant to be. The blood trail veered sharply, weaving between trees and over roots as though the creature had retreated in a frenzy. I followed it with growing unease, my revolver raised, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. My mind churned with questions I didn't dare voice aloud. What was that thing? Where had it come from? And why had it attacked? Then the trail ended abruptly, disappearing into a yawning pit. I stopped at the edge, shining my flashlight down into the hole. It was deep, too deep for the light to reach the bottom. The edges were jagged, as if something had clawed its way through the earth, and the air rising from it was heavy with an unnatural chill. And then I heard it, the growl, low and guttural, reverberating from the depths. It wasn't alone down there. I could hear movement, scraping, shifting, the sounds of something massive and alive. I crouched down, trying to steady my breathing as I peered into the pit. The beam of my flashlight caught glimpses of movement far below. A flash of fur, the gleam of sharp teeth. My pulse hammered as I realized the truth. The creature wasn't just fleeing. It was retreating to wherever it had come from. Adin, a lair. I wanted to run, to leave this nightmare behind and drag Martin to safety. But then I saw it, tangled in the roots at the edge of the pit, a scrap of red fabric. Gingham, soaked in blood. The woman. I grabbed it, my mind racing. Could she still be alive? Could the creature have dragged her down there, leaving the bodies in the clearing as bait? I didn't know, but the idea that she might still be alive, that there might still be a chance, overrode every instinct screaming at me to run. I called into the radio again, my voice tight and shaking. Caro, this is Trennan. I found something. A pit. Blood. Movement below. I need reinforcements. Do you copy? Nothing but static. I stared into the pit, the growl growing louder now, vibrating through my bones. My flashlight flickered, its beams sputtering as if struggling against the oppressive darkness. And then I saw it again, those glowing eyes staring back at me from the depths. Watching, waiting, the glowing eyes bore into me, unblinking and alien, as if the creature was measuring my fear. The growl grew into a low, rolling rumble, a sound that vibrated in my chest and made my knees weaken. My instincts screamed for me to flee, but I stood frozen, unable to tear my gaze away from the void below. And then it moved. The creature surged upward, a ripple of shadow and malice clawing its way toward the surface. Dirt and stones cascaded into the pit, and I stumbled back, raising my revolver with trembling hands. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. I fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the monster for a split second. It was massive, its body a nightmare of fur and muscle, its eyes burning like coals in the abyss. The bullet struck its shoulder, but it barely flinched, letting out a guttural snarl that sent shockwaves of terror through me. Behind me, I heard Martin shout weakly, "Dale, run!" For God's sake, run. But I couldn't leave him. Not like this. I fired again, aiming for the creature's head. The shot struck true, a spray of dark blood spattering the ground, but it didn't stop. It lunged forward faster than anything that size should move. And then a deafening crack. A single rifle shot rang out from behind me. The creature howled, a sound that made my blood run cold, and recoiled, retreating slightly. I turned to see Martin slumped against a tree, his rifle raised with the last of his strength. His face was pale, his chest soaked with blood, but his eyes burned with determination. "Go," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I'll hold it off, Martin." I yelled, but he fired again, the shot echoing through the forest. The creature roared, its massive frame twisting as it turned toward him. Martin looked at me one last time, his face a mask of defiance and acceptance. "Get out of here, Dale. Tell them what happened. Make it count." Before I could argue, the creature lunged at him. The sight was something I'll never forget. Martin's body swallowed by claws and fangs as the thing dragged him into the pit. His screams echoed once, then were smothered by the blackness. The forest fell silent. I didn't remember running, but I must have, because I found myself stumbling back toward the wrecked car. My flashlight flickered weakly, the blood trail barely visible in the faint beam. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each step driven by instinct and terror. When I reached the car, the forest around me felt different, quieter, almost empty. I half expected the creature to burst from the trees, but nothing came. The only sound was my pounding heart and the wind whispering through the branches. I climbed into the Jeep, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored it, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped back toward the ranger station. My mind raced, a storm of fear, guilt, and disbelief. Martin was gone, the couple was dead, and that thing, it was still out there. When I reached the station, I collapsed against the desk, gasping for air. The radio crackled to life as I slumped into the chair, my body trembling. "Dale?" It was Caro's voice, sharp with worry. "We got a team heading your way. What's your status?" For a moment, I couldn't answer. The words caught in my throat, tangled with grief and horror. Finally, I managed to whisper, "It's still out there." They found me hours later, pale and shaking, my clothes torn and stained with blood. Search teams combed the forest for days, but they found no sign of the creature. The pit was gone, collapsed as if it had never existed. All that remained were faint tracks and bloodstains near the wrecked car. Martin's body was never recovered. The official report listed the incident as a wild animal attack, though no one could identify the predator responsible. The park was closed indefinitely, declared unsafe for public access. I handed in my badge a week later, unable to face the woods again. Now, years later, I sit here in my quiet home, telling this story to my grandson Liam. He listens intently, his journalist's notebook open on the table between us. When I finish, he looks at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you think it's still out there?" he asks softly. I glance toward the window, where the shadows of the trees stretch long in the fading light. The memory of those glowing eyes, that guttural growl, haunts me like a shadow that won't leave. "I know it is," I say, "and if you're smart, Liam, you'll stay far away from the Blackstone Woods. The silence that follows feels heavier than the years I've carried this secret. Somewhere out there, in the depths of that cursed forest, I know the creature is waiting, watching, and I pray it never comes for me again. My name is Daniel Briggs. I worked as a park ranger, and it's been over 20 years since that day, but I remember it like it was yesterday. The autumn sun was just beginning its descent when my partner, Emily Carroll, and I set out on a routine patrol of Clear Ridge Park. The park's dense wilderness, sprawling with ancient trees and misty trails, was both our office and our sanctuary. Little did we know, that day would carve itself into my mind like a brand. We had been alerted by a hiker earlier that morning about strange noises emanating from the east end of the park, an area rarely ventured into due to its rough terrain. Emily and I decided to check it out. As we moved deeper into the forest, the noises started, faint at first, a low hum, like wind moving through a hollow, though the trees around us were still. Emily shot me a look, her green eyes narrowing with curiosity. "You hear that?" she asked. "Hard to miss." I replied, gripping the handle of my flashlight a little tighter. The sound seemed to guide us, pulling us off the familiar trail and into uncharted territory. We pushed through dense underbrush, our boots crunching against twigs and damp leaves. Emily was in the lead, her usual confidence unshaken despite the eerie silence of the forest around us. That's when we saw it, a cave, a gaping mouth in the side of a rocky hill that neither of us remembered ever seeing before. The entrance was jagged, like broken teeth, and veiled by tendrils of moss and ivy. It didn't belong there. Emily took a few cautious steps closer. "Was this here before?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not on any map I've seen." And I'd seen plenty. I'd spent years combing through topographical surveys of the park. This cave was new, or worse, unnoticed. The humming sound grew louder as we approached, now interspersed with faint whispers that I convinced myself were just echoes of the wind. Emily switched on her flashlight and aimed it into the darkness. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating uneven walls that shimmered faintly as though wet. Without a word, she stepped inside. "And wait," I called after her, but she was already a few steps ahead, her silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Reluctantly, I followed. The air inside was cool and damp, heavy with a metallic scent that made my stomach churn. The floor sloped downward, and the walls seemed to close in the farther we went. That strange humming persisted, echoing off the stone in unnatural ways, as if the cave itself were alive and breathing. We stumbled upon the first pile of belongings about 50 feet in. It was an odd assortment of things: an old leather boot, a rusted lantern, a torn flannel shirt. Everything was tattered and filthy, as though it had been here for decades. "This stuff looks ancient," Emily murmured, crouching down to examine the lantern. "But there's no rust on the ground, like someone dropped it yesterday. Or left it behind," I muttered, my voice trailing off as I noticed something farther in. Another pile, then another, each one more disturbing than the last. Clothes, backpacks, toys. The items were layered in dust, but there was no denying what they were: remnants of lives that had vanished. The air seemed thicker now, and I could feel it pressing against my chest like a physical weight. "We need to turn back," I said, my voice firm. "This isn't right." Emily ignored me. She'd stopped near a small pile, her flashlight fixed on a pink hairbrush. Her hand hovered above it as recognition dawned in her expression. This belonged to that missing girl," she said. "Samantha Willis. The one who disappeared 2 months ago." A chill ran down my spine. She was right. The girl's photo had been plastered across every news station in the state. I'd seen her holding that very hairbrush in one of them. The whispers and laughter. The humming intensified, drowning out our breathing. And then we heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle that seemed to come from all directions at once. Emily froze, her eyes snapping to mine. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the laughter was joined by the unmistakable sound of crying. Children's voices echoing in the dark. A primal fear gripped me. My flashlight flickered as the sound grew louder, almost mocking. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing Emily's arm. But she yanked it free. "We can't. What if she's still alive?" she argued. "We have to keep going." I hesitated. Emily's determination was as relentless as ever, and part of me hated myself for wanting to abandon a potential survivor. But something was wrong here, deeply wrong. Still, I followed her deeper into the cave. The tunnel narrowed, forcing us to move single file. The crying and laughter seemed to recede, replaced by a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves shifting in a breeze. Then I saw them. 2 glowing eyes staring at us from the darkness. They weren't human. "Run," I croaked, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I turned and bolted, expecting Emily to follow. The cave seemed to twist and writhe around me as I ran, the walls closing in and shifting like something alive. That humming noise had become deafening now, reverberating in my skull. I burst into the daylight, gasping for air and spinning around. But Emily wasn't behind me. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The forest was silent. For a moment, I considered going back in, but the glowing eyes haunted my vision. Fear paralyzed me. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me back toward our vehicle. I needed backup, supplies, something. When I reached the car, I realized I had left the cave behind. I turned back to mark its location, but it was gone. The hillside was smooth, unbroken, and covered in moss as if the cave had never existed. Emily was gone. The days following Emily's disappearance were a blur of chaotic searches and tense interrogations. I recounted the story of the cave, its eerie whispers, and the glowing eyes to the park rangers and authorities. My tale, however, was met with skepticism and hushed whispers. No one believed me. Search parties scoured the area where the cave had been. They brought in dogs, drones, and even geological equipment. Yet, no trace of Emily or the mysterious cave could be found. The more I tried to convince them of what I had seen, the more their disbelief turned to thinly veiled suspicion. They began questioning my involvement in Emily's disappearance. Her family, once warm and welcoming, grew cold. Her father's grief turned to fury, and her mother's eyes were red with tears every time she saw me. Even my own family started to doubt my innocence. My brother, always the logical one, said, "Maybe it's time to admit you don't remember what really happened." My father's silence was worse than his words. Only my mother believed me, or at least pretended to. Her quiet support was the thin thread keeping me from unraveling completely. But the weight of the accusations and the guilt of losing Emily gnawed at my sanity. I took to walking the park at night, a flashlight in one hand and a notebook in the other. I mapped every trail, marked every sound, hoping, praying that the cave would reappear. Each rustle of leaves or distant animal cry made my heart race, but the cave never returned. Instead, the humming followed me. It began faint, barely audible over the wind, but as the nights went on, it grew louder. Sometimes I would wake in a cold sweat, the sound vibrating in my chest, as if the source was inside me. One night, while tracing the area where the cave had been, I found something chilling. A small rock etched with a symbol I didn't recognize, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. The rock was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly as though alive. I pocketed it and hurried home, my hands trembling. The night the cave returned, I wasn't even searching for it. I had given up, resigned to the fact that whatever had taken Emily would remain a mystery. I was walking the trails, more out of habit than hope, when the humming began again, louder and more insistent than ever. The air grew thick and charged, making my skin prickle. Then, through the trees, I saw it, the cave exactly as it had been that fateful day. The jagged mouth loomed in the moonlight, its mossy veil swaying in an unnatural wind. My heart raced as I approached, flashlight trembling in my hand. This time, I didn't hesitate. Emily was in there. I could feel it. The humming grew deafening as I stepped inside, the air cold and metallic. About 20 feet in, my light caught something on the ground. My breath hitched. It was Emily. She lay unconscious, her clothes torn and bloodied, but she was breathing. Emily! I dropped to my knees, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "It's me. I've got you." She murmured something incoherent, and I hoisted her onto my shoulders. The cave felt alive around us, the walls pulsating with a dim, sickly glow. Shadows moved in the periphery of my vision, but I didn't look. I couldn't. I had to get her out. As we stumbled into the forest, the humming faded. I collapsed near the car, Emily cradled in my arms. She stirred, her voice barely above a whisper. It was watching me," she said. "It has so many eyes. Too many. And its skin, it moves, Daniel. It moves like it's alive." And there were paws in the shadows, just watching. I froze at her words, but she continued. "It didn't feel like days, Daniel. It was only half an hour in there. Just half an hour. But it was endless." She began to sob, clinging to me like a child. I held her, my mind racing with questions I couldn't ask yet. The cave was gone when I looked back. The hillside stood smooth and silent, as if mocking me. But I didn't care. I had Emily back. Whatever had taken her, whatever horror lived in that cave, it had let her go for now. When we returned to the ranger station, the park was abuzz with questions. Emily's reappearance had stirred the community, but the answers she and I gave were carefully rehearsed. We told them about a bear attack, a vicious one, explaining her torn clothes and unconscious state. The society was divided. Some cheered Emily's miraculous return, grateful that she had survived. Others whispered accusations, saying I had staged the disappearance or worse. Her family's relief overshadowed their lingering suspicions, but trust wasn't something I could hope for anymore. Emily and I had made a pact. We would not speak of the cave. It wasn't there. We agreed, and no one would believe us if we told the truth. The humming, the eyes, the shadows, they belonged to the silence now. Whatever had happened in that cave, it was better left buried in the forest's dark heart. We both knew the truth, though. The cave was still out there waiting, and it would not forget us.